Hello, welcome to this presentation for the syntax lecture, and this time we're going to review what we've said about determiners and possessors. Now, have a quick recap of what we've already said about determiners and determiner phrases. We've said that the determiner is the head of a determiner phrase. And determiners can come in one of a number of kinds of determiners. You can get the kinds of determiners which appear all by themselves inside the DP. These are ones that we normally refer to as personal pronouns, like him or he, or she or her, etc., etc. Another kind of determiner is the kind of determiner that does have a complement. The complement that determiners always have when they have complements is a noun phrase. So you get things like the house. Here the determiner is the kind of thing that we usually refer to as the article, like the or a. We can also have demonstratives like this, that, or these or those, and other kinds of determiners like quantifiers like some or many or each, things like that. So that's another kind of determiner, the kind that always is accompanied by a noun phrase complement. We've also claimed that inside the DP we can get a possessor, and the possessor is something which sits in the specifier position of the DP. So in something like John's house, John's here is the possessor, DP, sitting in the specifier position of the whole DP. Now, it's this construction that I think we need to say more about, because we just left it at that when we introduced this idea, but there's something odd about this construction. Let's just concentrate on the determiner element inside this phrase. Note, as we've drawn it here, there's nothing in the determiner position. There is no determiner apparently. So we just have the possessor, John's, and the NP complement, house, and then the determiner head position seems to be empty. And in fact, it turns out that you can't fill that determiner position with a determiner. So if you try to put any determiner into that position, like the here, you end up with something which is ungrammatical. So John's the house, John's a house, or John's this house. All these things just don't work. So it looks as though the possessors and determiners are in complementary distribution. When you get one, you can't get the other, and vice versa. Now, that's a bit odd, because up till now we've taken the occurrence of complementary distribution to indicate that two elements are the same thing, i.e. they're trying to sit in the same structural position, and that's why they're in complementary distribution. But that would seem to argue that possessors are determiners. If they're in complementary distribution with determiners, then a possessor should be a determiner head of a DP, not the specifier position. But that is a very odd conclusion. It violates all sorts of principles that we've looked at so far, the main one being that phrases can't be heads. Heads are words. That's the word position inside a phrase, and a phrase can't occupy a word position. Phrases occupy phrase positions, words occupy word positions, but fairly clearly possessors are phrases. We could have had something like the man's house, or the man that I met's house. Okay, so that possessor there is obviously a phrase, not just a word. And if that is true, then it can't be a determiner, because determiners are words. So the observation then is a very strange one, that possessors and determiners should be in complementary distribution. There's got to be some other explanation for why possessors and determiners distribute like they do, rather than to say that they are one and the same kind of thing. Now, one indication that that is the right way to look at it is the fact that it's not true in all languages that possessors and determiners are in complementary distribution. Have a look at this example, which is a case of Hungarian. where at least with one of the forms of the possessors in Hungarian, you can get it quite easily along with a determiner. So we've got Jánosnak a háza, where Jánosnak is the possessor in a particular form, the knock-neck form here. That seems to be sitting in front of a determiner, presumably therefore in the specifier position of the DP. The determiner heads the DP and it takes an NP complement. Now there's more to be said about Hungarian possessors, but we won't go into the depths of that analysis. All I want to point out to you here is that the fact that this example exists shows us that it's not unreasonable to assume that possessors and determiners can appear together, and therefore it's not the case that possessors and determiners are always going to be in complementary distribution. This seems to be a fact about English, and therefore we need a language-specific explanation for this particular distributional fact. In order to do that, we're going to have a look at this element, the s thing that you get onto the end of the possessors in English. In some ways, it's a bit like the neck-knock morpheme that you get on the possessor in Hungarian, Jánosnak there. That's usually considered to be a case morpheme, more specifically in Hungarian, a dative case. Now the s element that we get on John's house has been claimed to be, again, a kind of a case morpheme. Specifically, it's thought to be the genitive. And the reason for that is that historically, at least, it derives from what was a genitive case marker. In Old English, rather like present-day German, nouns had 4 different cases, depending on which class of noun they belong to. So, for example, let's take a noun like the king, as in the noun phrase the king. The 4 forms were nominative, accusative, genitive, and dative, just like they are in present-day German. Now, again, just like present-day German, it's the determiners which mainly show you which case the noun phrase has, or the determiner phrase has. So they change depending on which case there is. In the nominative, it's se, and in the accusative, it's thonne. Genitive is thas, and in dative, it's tham. Okay, so we mark the case on the determiner, but depending again on the noun and the class the noun has, sometimes some of the nouns also have a different form. With this particular case, king, which is a masculine noun in Old English, the nominative and accusative forms of the noun itself were the same. So kinning, okay, is the same in both nominative and accusative. But note, the genitive and dative forms do differ. So we have kinninges and kinninge. Okay. Now, the important observation to make here is the form of the genitive, both on the determiner, das, and also on the noun itself, this particular noun, we get kinninges. It's an S form. Okay, and that is the historical root of the S genitive in modern English. Now, at some point in the Middle English period, English lost most of its cases. So all these different case forms on the determiners and on the nouns and also on adjectives as well, they just disappeared, and we end up with the current system where there's very little in terms of case forms. In fact, in English, modern day English, the only thing that shows any case forms is the set of personal pronouns, that subset of determiners. So that's what we get the difference between he, him, and his, or my, I, and me cases. Okay, however, it seems as though this S form was maintained from the Old English system. Okay, so it looks then that English lost its nominative and accusative and dative forms, but somehow managed to maintain its genitive form. However, when we start looking at the behaviour of this S element on the possessor, we begin to see that actually it doesn't seem to behave at all like a case morpheme. For example, it doesn't behave at all like the neck-knock morpheme that we find on Hungarian possessors. Let's have a look at how it actually behaves. Take something like the king's crown. Okay, so here we've got a possessor, the king, and the S that marks the possessor here, or maybe the genitive case, is attached to where you'd expect it to be onto the noun. Okay, so it's king's crown. Okay, however, if we make a slightly more complicated possessor and have the phrase the King of England as the possessor, note this time the S attaches itself not to king but to England. Now that's very odd, because it's not here England that should be genitive. It's not England that is semantically viewed as the possessor. It's still the king who is the possessor of the crown, and therefore that being the head noun of the whole phrase, one would expect should bear the genitive case. But it would actually be ungrammatical to say the Kings of England crown. Okay? So we can't actually stick this thing onto the noun where we would expect it to be. If you compared that to the way Hungarian would work, the neck-knock morpheme would be attached to the noun and not to some other element. And in fact, this gets even worse if we have different kinds of noun phrases or determiner phrases in the possessor position. For example, take the king who had his head cut off. Okay, and we put that as the possessor of the crown, then we get the king who had his head cut off's crown. And this S element actually sticks itself onto a preposition, not onto a noun at all. And in fact, we can find lots of different cases where the S is attached to other kinds of words. So the king who was executed's crown, there we've got it attached to a verb. And even more long and complicated, the king of England who was executed by having his head cut off's crown. Okay, so this S thing does not seem to behave at all like a case morpheme does. And in fact, it's fairly obvious that if you look at this data here, what's going on is that S element isn't attaching itself to any particular word in the possessor DP at all. What it's doing is attaching itself to the end of the whole DP. It seems, therefore, that what we've got is the morpheme. This S morpheme, the supposedly genitive S morpheme, is attaching itself to a phrase, not to a word. Now, that's very odd, and it's certainly very odd for a case morpheme. Case morphemes are things that attach themselves to nouns in most languages, not to phrases. And obviously, the whole idea of a phrasal morpheme is a bit of an odd thing, because morphemes are usually seen to be things which are parts of words, not parts of phrases. In fact, what we have here is often referred to as a clitic. A clitic is an independent element which becomes phonologically attached to something in its immediate environment. So this S morpheme, the marker of the possessor, seems to be independent of the actual possessor phrase itself. It's not part of that phrase, but it's something which is phonologically dependent on that phrase. Now, to get a more better insight into what this thing actually is, we have to look at some other phenomena, because English actually does show other phenomena which is remarkably similar to what's going on here with this possessive S marker. To see this, we have to turn to the clause. Take a sentence like, the king will be executed. Now, in spoken English, there's another way to put this, where we don't actually pronounce the will. It gets contracted to something like ul, and this ul thing gets attached to whatever it is that appears in front of it. So you get the king will be executed. Okay, so it looks as though this ul, the contracted will, is sticking itself onto the end of king. But if we make the subject slightly more complicated, we'll find that the ul doesn't attach itself to king at all, but it attaches itself to the end of the whole subject. So if we've got the King of England, then it'll be the King of England will be executed. Or if it was the king who had his head cut off, it would be the king who had his head cut off will be executed. So this all attaches itself to the end of the whole subject. Now, let's see what's actually going on here. Will is a modal auxiliary, and as we know, modal auxiliaries are inflections, and inflections are the head of the clause, the IP part of the clause at least. So what we've got then here is that the inflection, the head of the clause, can, or at least this particular one, can undergo a phonological process of contraction where we lose the part of the word itself and it reduces to this ul form. And then by this process known as cliticization, it moves and it sticks itself onto, well, its own specifier, that is the subject. Okay, so we say that the head of the IP cliticizes to its specifier. And as I said, a clitic is a word which becomes phonologically attached to something else within its immediate environment. In English, it seems as though it's the thing that precedes it that the clitic inflection becomes attached to, i.e. the subject in this case. Now, let's go back and take what we've learned from this to apply to what's going on inside the DP. As we've seen, we've got this clitic-like S, possessive S element that is stuck onto the whole of the possessor. Now, if we apply the what's going on with the contracted ul in the clause, which is the head of the IP attaching itself to its own specifier, then we reverse engineer that kind of analysis. Well, that would seem to suggest that what's going on here is that this S is moving from the head position and attaching itself to its own specifier, just like the head of the inflection phrase can, under the condition of contraction, be attached to its own specifier, i.e. the subject. Then the S seems to do exactly the same sort of thing and attaches itself to its own specifier, which of course is the possessor. But then that leads us to the conclusion that this S thing is a determiner. It's the head of the DP, just like the ul is the head of the IP. And that then leads us to understand what's actually going on when we notice that you can't have a determiner along with a possessor. Okay, you can't say the king's the crown. And it isn't because the possessor and the determiner are in complementary distribution, i.e. that they're not the things that are sitting in the same place, but what's in complementary distribution is the possessive determiner, i.e. this s element, which is a determiner that appears whenever there's a possessor. That's the thing that's sitting in the determiner position, and that's the thing which is in complementary distribution with all other determiners. So we can account for, therefore, why you can't get a determiner and a possessor in English under these assumptions. Okay, let's quickly go through and summarize everything we've said in today's lecture. Okay, we started off with the idea that the possessor is in the specifier of the DP. Okay, that's something that we've previously put forward. But we noted that possessors and determiners can't appear together, which was a very odd observation because it would seem to suggest that possessors are determiners, and that just simply can't be. We noted that the Old English genitive S has changed its status. English, as I said, lost its cases, but it seemed to maintain this S. However, it didn't maintain it as a genitive case at all. It seemed to maintain it as something else. And this turned into what is now in modern English a kind of determiner, the possessive determiner, in fact. The possessive determiner appears only whenever there's a possessor. So when we have a possessor, we must have a possessive determiner. When there's no possessor, there's no possessive determiner. That's why the possessor and this S appear always together. And of course, once the possessor and the possessive determiner are there, then we're going to find complementary distribution with all other kinds of determiners, because no two determiners can occupy the same position. Okay, that's enough for today, and I'll give another presentation for next week. Bye-bye.